Approaches to Psychology. Introduction to Psychology Unit 2. An approach is a perspective or view that involves certain assumptions or beliefs about human behavior regarding the way they function, which aspects of them are worthy of study, and what research methods are appropriate for undertaking this study. While psychologists may differ on which kinds of behavior are important, they do agree that the study of behavior must be systematic. The use of a systematic method of asking and answering questions about why people think, act, and feel as they do reduces the chances of coming to false conclusions. Many different approaches are necessary to understand the complex richness of human behavior. There may be several different theories within an approach, but they all share these common assumptions. The biological approach. Psychologists operating from this perspective tend to search for the causes of behavior in the functioning of the brain and biochemical processes. It is relevant for you to note that this approach has become more and more important in recent years as we learn more about the brain and brain chemistry. A psychologist working from this perspective might, for example, search for abnormalities in the brain chemistry of depressed people. The psychologists might try to alleviate the symptoms by suggesting techniques such as administering antidepressant drugs, thus altering the brain's chemistry. The psychodynamic approach. This approach is linked to the writings of Sigmund Freud. Freud believes that human behavior stems from inherited instincts, biological drive, and attempts to resolve the competing demands of personal needs and society's expectations. According to Freud, a great deal of an individual's personality is determined in the first 5 years of life, when some of these conflicts are being resolved. You must also note that Freud laid great emphasis on the role of the unconscious mind in producing behavior. In addition, a lot of his work involved trying to find ways of tapping into the unconscious. You need to remember that while psychologists do not refer to Freud's writings a great deal today, there are some areas, for example aggression, where his views may be relevant. We will discuss more on aggression later in this course. Psychology is a study of mind. This perspective is divided into two. 1. Structuralism. The establishment of psychology as a separate, formal field of study is widely thought to have begun in 1879 in Leipzig, Germany, when Wilhelm Wundt started his laboratory of psychology. In his laboratory, he modeled his research on the mind after that in other natural sciences he had studied. He developed a method of self-observation called introspection to collect information about the mind. In carefully controlled situations, trained subjects reported their thoughts, and Wundt tried to map out the basic structure of thought processes. Wundt's experiments were very important historically, not so much because he advanced our understanding of the mind, but because his work attracted many students who carried on the tradition of psychological research. 2. Functionalism. Regarded as a close rival for the honor of founder of psychology, the American psychologist William James. In his text Principles of Psychology, 1890, James speculated that thinking, feeling, learning, remembering and all activities of the mind serve one major function, to help us survive as a species. Rather than focusing on the structure of the mind as Wundt did, James focused on the functions of the conscious mind and the goals or functions of behaviors. Although James did not produce any significant experimental findings, his writings and theories are still influential. Psychology is the study of unconscious processes. Psychoanalysis. While the first psychologists were interested in understanding the conscious mind, Sigmund Freud, a physician who practiced in Vienna until 1938, was more interested in the unconscious mind. He believed that our conscious experiences are only the tip of the iceberg, that beneath the surface are primitive biological urges that are in conflict with the requirements of society and morality. According to Freud, these unconscious motivations and conflicts are responsible for most human behavior. He thought that they were responsible for many medically unexplainable physical symptoms that troubled his patients. Freud used a new method for indirectly studying unconscious processes. In this technique, known as free association, a patient said everything that came to mind, no matter how absurd or irrelevant it seemed, without attempting to produce logical or meaningful statements. The person was instructed not to edit or censor the thoughts. Freud's role, that of psychoanalyst, was to be objective. He merely sat and listened, then interpreted the associations. Free association, Freud believed, revealed the operation of unconscious processes. Freud also believed that dreams are expressions of the most primitive unconscious urges. To learn more about these urges, he developed dream analysis, which is basically an extension of free association in which the patient applied the same technique to his or her dreams. Freud, 1940. Unfortunately, this approach has been criticized in the way that it overemphasizes the importance of sexuality and underemphasized of the role of social relationships. The theory is not scientific, and cannot be proved as it is circular. Nevertheless, psychoanalysis has been greatly contributory to psychology in that it has encouraged many modern theorists to modify it for the better, using its basic principles, but eliminating its major flaws. Psychology is the study of individual differences. Sir Francis Galton, a 19th-century English mathematician and scientist, wanted to understand how heredity, inherited traits, influences a person's abilities, character, and behavior. Galton, 1869, traced the ancestry of various eminent people and found that greatness runs in families. This was appropriate, since Galton himself was considered a genius and his family included at least one towering intellectual figure, a cousin named Charles Darwin. He therefore concluded that genius or eminence is a hereditary trait. This conclusion was like the blind men's ideas about the elephant. Galton did not consider the possibility that the tendency of genius to run in eminent families might be a result of the exceptional environments and socio-economic advantages that also tend to run in such families. Galton's writings raised the issue of whether behavior is determined by heredity or environment, a subject that remains a focus of controversy. Galton's influence can also be seen in the current widespread use of psychological tests. Evolutionary approach. This approach studies how evolutionary ideas, such as adaptation and natural selection, explain behaviors and mental processes. A central claim of evolutionary psychology is that the brain, and therefore the mind, evolved to solve problems encountered by our hunter-gatherer ancestors during the Upper Pleistocene period over 10,000 years ago. The evolutionary approach explains behavior in terms of the selective pressures that shape behavior. Most behaviors that we see/display are believed to have developed during our environment of evolutionary adaptation, to help us survive. Psychology is the study of observable behavior. Behaviorism. The pioneering work of Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, who won the Nobel Prize in 1904 for his studies related to the physiology of digestion, charted another new course for psychological investigation. In a now famous experiment, Pavlov rang a tuning fork each time he gave a dog some meat powder. The dog would naturally salivate when the powder reached its mouth. After Pavlov repeated the procedure several times, the dog would salivate when it heard the tuning fork, even if no food appeared. It had been conditioned to associate the sound with the food. Psychologists who stressed investigating observable behavior became known as behaviorists. Their position, as formulated by American psychologist John Broadus Watson, 1924, was that psychology should concern itself only with the observable facts of behavior. Watson further maintained that all behavior, even apparently instinctive behavior, is the result of conditioning and occurs because the appropriate stimulus is present in the environment. Although it was Watson who defined and solidified the behaviorist position, it was Frederick B. Skinner, another American psychologist, who refined and popularized it. Behaviorism has been criticized in the way it underestimates the complexity of human behavior. Many studies used animals which are hard to generalize to humans and it cannot explain, for example the speed in which we pick up language. There must be biological factors involved. Humanism. Humanistic psychology developed as a reaction to the behavioral movement. Humanistic psychologists, notably Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and Rollo May, describe human nature as active and creative rather than passively reacting to external stimuli. Humanistic psychology is a psychological perspective that emphasizes the study of the whole person, known as holism. Humanistic psychologists look at human behavior, not only through the eyes of the observer, but through the eyes of the person doing the behaving. The humanistic perspective centers on the view that each person is unique and individual, and has the free will to change at any time in his or her lives. The humanistic perspective suggests that we are each responsible for our own happiness and well-being as humans. We have the innate, i.e. inborn, capacity for self-actualization, which is our unique desire to achieve our highest potential as people. Unlike behaviorists, humanists feel that the human mind is able to influence and change the world in which it functions. Psychology is the study of cognitive processes. Another reaction to the narrow perspective of stimulus response, explanations of behavior has been the growing importance since the mid-1970s, of internal, or cognitive, explanations of behavior. Sometimes using computer-based models of behavior for their studies, cognitive psychologists recognize that some of the processes that govern human and animal behavior are internal. We perceive and interpret our world, we think about problems, we constantly assess our knowledge of ourselves and others, and we use language to communicate with one another. The cognitive approach is concerned with mental functions such as memory, perception, attention, etc. It views people as being similar to computers in the way we process information, e.g. input process output. For example, both human brains and computers process information, store data, and have input and output procedure. This had led cognitive psychologists to explain that memory comprises of 3 stages. Encoding, where information is received and attended to. Storage, where the information is retained, and retrieval, where the information is recalled. It is an extremely scientific approach and typically uses lab experiments to study human behavior. The cognitive approach has many applications including cognitive therapy and eyewitness testimony. And thanks for your attention. See you next time.